The dining table was set for one. On the opposite end, a chair remained untouched, draped with the shawl his late wife used to wear on chilly evenings. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second pounding like a reminder that Edward Brooks, 74, was alone now, or so they thought. The front door opened without ceremony. His sons stepped inside, Daniel, crisp in his suit as if rehearsed for this moment, and Luke, carrying a stack of folders that smelled of lawyers and realtors. They didn't sit for small talk. They didn't ask about his health. "Dad," Daniel began, voice firm, "you're too old to manage this place. It's time for a nursing home." Luke slid the papers across the wooden table. "We'll sell the house. You'll be comfortable. Everything's arranged." Edward looked at their hands, their polished shoes, their impatient eyes. To them, he was a burden, an old man clinging to wood and brick. They thought age erased his rights. His fingers brushed the table's rough edge, where years ago his wife had leaned with soil still clinging to her hands after planting roses. Her voice came back to him. "This house will always have our heartbeat in it." Daniel nudged the pen closer. "Just sign, Dad. We'll take care of the rest." Edward's hand hovered over the page, trembling not with weakness, but with memory. 40 years I poured steel for men who never remembered my name. He thought, pressure never broke me, it forged me. The clock ticked. The pen rolled against his wedding band. Edward lifted it, then stopped, eyes locked on the empty chair across the table. A silence fell so heavy it felt like thunder waiting to break. The pen in Edward's hand shook. His sons watched with a strange mix of impatience and certainty, as if the moment he signed would confirm what they'd always believed, that he was finished. "Come on, Dad," Luke urged softly, like coaxing a stubborn child. "You won't even notice. The home has nurses, warm meals, everything you'll ever need." Daniel leaned back, arms crossed, his voice sharper. "You'll be safe there. You can't keep up with this place. The house is too much for you. Just sign and stop making this harder than it needs to be." Edward stared at the paper. The words blurred into a white sea of betrayal. His pulse thudded in his ears. He imagined himself signing. Imagined the roses ripped from the soil, the rooms stripped bare, his wife's laughter buried under a realtor's sold sign. His chest tightened. For a flicker of a moment, he almost believed them. Maybe he was too old. Maybe he was clinging to memories that no longer belonged to the living. Daniel smirked, mistaking silence for surrender. "You've done enough, Dad. We'll handle things from here." Edward's hand froze. He set the pen down carefully, as if returning a weapon he refused to use. His eyes, cloudy with age but steady as steel, lifted to meet his son's. "I'm not finished yet," he said quietly. The words landed heavier than a shout. To Daniel, it was stubbornness. To Luke, it was delusion. But inside Edward's chest, something long dormant stirred. The furnace that had once fired steel had not gone out, it was only waiting. The tick of the clock faded into the clang of hammers. The smell of sawdust and steel filled the air. Edward was young again, bare arms streaked with sweat and soot, sparks flying around him as molten steel poured into molds in a Pittsburgh mill. The heat was suffocating, the foreman's shouts relentless, but Edward's hands never faltered. Those hands, scarred, blackened, blistered, built the life that would one day shelter his family. Nights bled into mornings. On payday, he and Mary rode the bus across town, clutching envelopes of cash. They didn't buy much. No fancy cars, no vacations, just savings, one brick at a time. And then the house, a plain wooden frame, crooked roof, peeling paint. Most would have passed it by. But Mary stood in the yard, her fingers brushing wildflowers, her smile brighter than the morning sun. "This one, Ed," she whispered. "It doesn't look like much now, but it will, for us." He saw her then kneeling in the dirt, planting roses beneath the porch window. Her laugh carried through the years. "This house will always have our heartbeat in it." Memory shifted again, Mary in her final days, the roses blooming outside while she rested inside. her hand frail but steady as she gripped his. "Promise me," she murmured, voice soft as a breath. "They'll never take it from you, not while you're alive." And so he did. In those raw, grief-stained months after her passing, he had walked into a lawyer's office, papers trembling in his hands. He signed the deed that no one else knew about, securing his right to live there until the end of his days. A silent contract of love sealed in law, the flashback dissolved. Edward blinked back at the dining table. His sons still sat before him, papers ready, impatience dripping from every glance. But now the house wasn't just walls and wood. It was his life, his promise, his proof that love could outlast death. The smell of roast beef filled the small kitchen. For the first time in months, Daniel and Luke had offered to cook for their father. They set the table with forced cheer, pouring wine, laying out plates as if this were a celebration. Edward sat at the head of the table, his late wife's chair still empty beside him. The laughter his sons forced between bites clanged hollow against the walls. Luke raised his glass. "To family," he said. The words rang false. Edward lifted his water slowly, eyes narrowing but said nothing. They waited until the plates were half finished, until his guard was dulled by the ritual of dinner. Then Daniel slid the folder across the table once more, his smile thin as paper. "Dad, let's not drag this out," he said, voice low but sharp. "You'll be safer in the home. No snow to shovel, no bills to stress over. It's what's best for you." Luke chimed in, softer, almost pleading. "Don't make this harder. Just sign. You'll thank us later." The pen appeared again, this time placed right next to his fork, as if it were another utensil, just part of the meal. Edward's eyes drifted past his sons to the wall above them. There hung a framed photograph, Mary in her garden, smiling with dirt on her hands, roses blooming wild around her. The sound of the clock faded. The scrape of forks went silent. All he could hear was her voice, echoing through the years. "This house will always have our heartbeat in it." Daniel leaned closer, irritation breaking through his mask. "Dad, stop being difficult. Sign the papers." Edward set down his fork, his jaw tightened. The silence stretched long, heavy, unyielding. Finally, he looked at his sons, not with anger, but with something sharper. A resolve they hadn't seen in years. But he said nothing, not yet. He let the silence speak for him. That night, the house was silent. The dinner dishes sat unwashed in the sink, a reminder of the ambush he'd endured. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters, but inside, Edward sat alone at the wooden table, staring at the empty chair across from him. For a long time, he didn't move. His sons' voices still echoed in his head, sharp, certain, dismissive, too old, too weak, too much for him to handle. But beneath the ache of betrayal, something stirred. A memory, a promise. Edward rose slowly and crossed the living room to an old oak desk wedged against the wall. Its drawers stuck from age, but he knew exactly which one to pull. With a grunt, he slid it open. His hand reached deep into the back, past faded photographs and yellowed letters, until his fingers found the thick envelope he'd hidden years ago. He drew it out, dust rising in the lamplight. The paper was worn but intact, sealed with the notary's stamp that had outlasted his grief. His thumb traced the bold letters at the top, Life Estate Deed. Edward's breath caught. The weight of it felt heavier than steel, steadier than any weapon he had ever carried. He sat back down at the table, turning the document carefully in his hands. The memory came rushing back, Mary's fragile hand in his, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Promise me, Ed. Promise me they'll never take it from you, not while you're alive." And he had promised. He had walked into that lawyer's office after the funeral, drowning in grief but clear in one thing: the house would remain his as long as he breathed. Signed, notarized, unshakable. A silent contract of love and defiance. Edward smiled then, faint but fierce. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerless. He pressed the deed flat against the table, whispering to the empty chair beside him. "Mary, you knew I'd need this someday." The wind rattled the windows. The roses outside rustled in the dark, and Edward Brooks, once a tired old man, now sat taller, the weight of steel in his spine again. The conference room smelled of polished wood and ink. A long table stretched beneath fluorescent lights, gleaming with contracts and empty coffee cups. On one side sat the real estate executives, sharp suits and sharper smiles. On the other, Daniel and Luke leaned in with smug anticipation, convinced today was the day they'd finally close the deal. Edward Brooks shuffled in slowly, cane tapping against the tiled floor. To the untrained eye, he looked every bit the part they wanted him to play, frail, weary, ready to be signed away. "Mr. Brooks," the lead agent said smoothly, sliding the papers forward. "We just need your signature here and the property transfer will be official, nothing to worry about." Daniel nudged his father's arm. "Go ahead, Dad, it's just a formality." Luke smirked, whispering under his breath, "It's over." Edward lowered himself into the chair. His hands trembled as he picked up the pen. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, watching the old man bow to inevitability. But then he set the pen down. Slowly, deliberately, the room rustled with confusion. Edward's gaze lifted, clear and unwavering. "This home," he said, his voice steady, "breathes with me, and you can't sell it while I still stand here." The agent frowned, exchanging glances with Daniel and Luke. "Sir, with all due respect," Edward reached into his worn leather satchel. The air shifted. He pulled out the thick envelope and laid it flat on the table. The notary seal caught the light like a flare. "Read it," he ordered. The agent blinked, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the document. Silence spread like wildfire, then a quiet gasp. This is a life estate deed," the agent stammered. He looked up, rattled. "Legally binding. This property cannot be transferred without Mr. Brooks's consent. As long as he lives, he remains the rightful occupant." Daniel's face drained of color. Luke sat frozen, lips parted, fury and disbelief colliding in his eyes. Edward pushed his chair back and stood, taller than he'd seemed in years. His voice rang like steel hammered on an anvil. "You mistook my silence for weakness, but the law remembers what you've forgotten. This house is mine, until my last breath." The conference room went still. The suits looked away, embarrassed. Daniel's fists clenched, Luke muttered curses under his breath. But no one could deny it, the old man had won. Daniel's chair screeched across the floor as he stood, face flushed with anger. "This is insane," he spat, pointing at the deed. "You'd rather rot alone in that crumbling house than let us help you." Luke slammed his hand on the table. "You think this is noble? It's pathetic. You're clinging to ghosts, Dad." Edward didn't flinch. He gathered the deed slowly, tucking it back into the envelope as if sealing away their greed. His voice was calm, almost tender. "No, I'm clinging to promises, and promises matter more than profit." The agents avoided eye contact, already closing their folders, embarrassed to have been pulled into this family war. Without another word, Daniel stormed toward the door. Luke followed, muttering under his breath, their expensive shoes echoing down the corridor until they disappeared. The room fell silent. Edward exhaled, heavy but free, as though a chain had just slipped from his shoulders. He stepped out into the sunlight beyond the glass doors. The world felt wider, brighter. By the week's end, word spread through town. Neighbors who had once thought of Edward as a recluse now knocked on his door. Mrs. Callahan from across the street brought a pot of soup. Mr. Ramirez offered to mend the fence. One by one they came, not with contracts or demands, but with laughter, with music, with life. On Sunday afternoon, Edward stood on his porch as the yard filled with voices. Children ran across the lawn. Old friends played cards under the maple tree. The house, once targeted for profit, was alive again, breathing the way Mary had promised it always would. Edward raised his voice so everyone could hear. "This house isn't just mine, it's ours. From today on, it's a place for anyone who needs it. We'll call it Mary's house." Applause rippled through the crowd, and for the first time in years, Edward felt the warmth of belonging, not just survival. He had not only defended his home, he had transformed it into a legacy. Morning broke over Pennsylvania with a soft hush. The first light of dawn spilled across the wooden porch, catching on dew-soaked petals of the roses Mary had planted decades ago. Their color burned brighter against the gray of the old siding, as if refusing to fade. Edward sat in his chair on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hands. His cane leaned against the railing, forgotten for the moment. From the yard came the sound of laughter, neighbors gathering, children chasing each other, the hum of voices weaving into a kind of music. He looked out at them, at the life breathing again within these walls, and felt the weight of silence lift. For years he had feared this house would become his tomb. Instead, it had become a heartbeat that outlived grief. Edward raised his eyes to the horizon where the sun pushed above the hills, painting the sky in gold. His voice, low and steady, carried like a benediction. "They thought I was too old to matter, but a life lived still has power. And as long as I breathe, this house breathes with me. When I'm gone, it will carry us both." The wind stirred the roses, petals trembling in the light. The screen door creaked as another neighbor stepped onto the porch, calling his name. Edward smiled. The house was no longer just his. It was alive, and it would remain alive. Mary's house, a legacy of love and defiance. Fade out.